turn on notifications and never miss the beginning of a new story again. Join us and be part of every chapter. In the heart of the kingdom of Israel, the shadow of apostasy hung like a shroud, and the land groaned under the weight of a judgment that tore the heavens and dried up life. King Ahab, weakened by his profane passion, had allowed Queen Jezebel, hard-hearted and foreign, to sow the worship of Baal and Asherah, transforming the ancient altars of the Eternal into forgotten ruins. The consequence was famine. The fields cracked open in thirsty wastelands. The rivers that once sang of life were reduced to beds of white dust, and the lament of mothers echoed in the villages ravaged by unbelief. Amidst this chaos of faith and nature, a solitary voice arose, that of Elijah the Tishbite, a man whose soul burned with zeal for Zion, but who now found himself forced into exile and dependent on discreet miracles, proving the apparent abandonment, while the people, blind and hungry, staggered between the vain hope of idols and the dying memory of the God of their fathers. The ordeal was a test, not only for the kingdom, but for the very soul of its prophet, who carried the weight of a nation in his prayers and the terrible secret of the divine punishment he himself had announced. The drought, lasting 3 long years and 6 months, was not a meteorological accident, but the seal of a prophecy, the silent cry of the Eternal against the betrayal of his people. Elijah, the messenger of this pronouncement, experienced the deepest solitude, forced to hide by the brook Cherith, fed by ravens that by superior order brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, a paradox of provision amidst desolation. His faith, like a beacon in the darkness, was forged in daily dependence, in the silence of the desert, where the only audible voice was that of his God. In stark contrast to the profane songs that filled Ahab's palace, the prophet felt the pain of every grain of sand lifted by the dry wind, the agony of every child dying of hunger, but his conviction never wavered. The divine design for this trial was purification, and the humiliation of the kingdom was the necessary prelude to the revelation of a power that bowed neither to kings nor to wooden gods. In that season of drought and mourning, Queen Jezebel, with her basalt arrogance and heart of ice, intensified her persecution, hunting down the true prophets of the Eternal with relentless fury, believing that by silencing the voice of truth, she could impose the lie of Baal. Her 450 prophets, sustained by the royal table and the illusion of power, paraded with pomp, performing frenzied rituals, crying out for rain that never came, and the skepticism of the people mingled with despair. They saw the land die and heard the empty cries of the priests of Baal, and doubt became a slow poison in their souls. Meanwhile, the Eternal had other plans for his anointed. When the brook Cherith dried up, Elijah was sent to the widow of Zarephath, a Gentile woman, who, in her extreme poverty, became the living testimony of divine multiplication. This period of seclusion was the forging of patience and irrefutable proof that God's faithfulness did not depend on circumstances, but on His word. Years of misery had passed, and the final confrontation had become inevitable, a spiritual reckoning that providence had ordained. The crisis had reached its peak. Famine gnawed at the backbone of Israel, and King Ahab, in his stubborn blindness, blamed Elijah for the tragedy, calling him the troubler of Israel. The prophet, however, returned to the monarch's presence not with fear, but with the authority that only obedience confers, reversing the accusation with solemn dignity. "It is not I who have troubled Israel, but you and your father's house, by abandoning the commandments of the Lord and following the Baals." That face-to-face moment was the harbinger of the great turning point, the announcement that the time of silent trial had ended. Elijah challenged Ahab to gather all the people and the prophets of Baal and Asherah on Mount Carmel, the stage chosen by the Almighty to dispel the darkness and manifest His glory, defining once and for all who truly reigned over Israel. Mount Carmel, with its verdant slopes and views of the Great Sea, became on that day the focal point of Israel's destiny, a natural amphitheater for divine judgment. The people, hungry and spiritually exhausted, climbed the mountain in an oppressive silence, driven by curiosity and a faint hope that the agony would end. There they were, divided in their hearts, hesitating between the invisible God of their ancestors and the Baal of stone and rituals who promised them fertility without demanding holiness. The 450 prophets of Baal, marching arrogantly and in colorful robes, displayed a confidence that would soon prove vain, certain that their numbers and royal support would be enough to crush the solitary voice of the Tishbite. Elijah, for his part, stood there, alone against a multitude of false prophets and a wavering nation, but protected by the certainty that the power that sustained him was the same that had created the mountain and the sea that stretched far away. The prophet of God, with his austere figure and gaze reflecting the flame of the desert, confronted the crowd with a question that cut through the air like lightning. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. The people's response was a heavy silence, the silence of indecision and guilt. It was a public accusation of the hypocrisy and spiritual division that had brought the kingdom to the brink of annihilation. That silence was more eloquent than any cry, revealing the profound suffering of a generation that had lost its way and exchanged immutable glory for the instability of idols. Elijah then proposed the epic challenge that 2 calves be prepared for sacrifice, one for Baal and the other for the eternal. The condition was simple, but impossible by human methods. No fire would be lit. The God who answered with fire, that would be the true God. The scene that followed was a spectacle of frenzy and despair, narrated by the omniscient observer with a mixture of indignation and pity. The prophets of Baal, accepting the challenge with blind faith, chose their calf and prepared their altar with empty pomp. They began their ritual at dawn, crying out in unison, "O Baal, answer us." Hours dragged on under the scorching sun, and their chants grew louder, their dances wilder, hoping to force a response from a non-existent deity. The narrator reveals the malice of the false prophets, driven not by faith, but by the maintenance of their status and royal power, and the skepticism that was beginning to emerge in the eyes of the people, who saw the futility of all that effort. Noon arrived, and the only audible sound was the echo of their own voices in the valley, a silence that betrayed the impotence of the idol. As the midday heat approached, Elijah, observing the pathetic spectacle with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the priest's agitation, began to mock them with biting irony. "Cry aloud," he cried, "for is he a god? Perhaps he is meditating or has gone away, or is on a journey, or maybe he is sleeping and needs to be awakened." The humiliation was complete. The prophets of Baal, driven to the brink of insanity by the exposure of their deception, redoubled their efforts, cutting themselves with knives and spears as was their custom, until blood flowed onto the stone altar, staining it with proof of their despair. The sun began its descent, and their sacrifice lay untouched, the wood dry and cold. The atmosphere on Carmel was heavy with tension and disillusionment. The people oscillated between impatience and the growing certainty that the God who had promised them rain was, in truth, a void. The stage was set for the manifestation of faith and divine triumph. As the hour of the evening's obliteration approached, the moment when, according to Israelite tradition, the night sacrifice was offered, Elijah stepped forward, his solitary figure taking on a monumental dimension before the exhausted crowd and the humiliated prophets of Baal. His countenance, once austere, now radiated a calm solemnity, the unwavering certainty of one in full communion with the higher will. He needed no hysterical cries or self-mutilation. His strength came from the covenant. The prophet's first act was symbolic. He called the people closer so that they might be eyewitnesses to every detail of the miracle that would follow, ensuring that there would be no room for doubt or allegations of deception. This was the moment of reconstruction, not only of the altar but of the faith of a nation. With the help of some men, Elijah began to rebuild the ancient altar of the Lord, which lay in ruins, using 12 stones, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, an act that underscored the lost unity and the eternal covenant that the people had broken. Each stone placed was a silent cry for the restoration of the nation, a reminder of the promise made to the patriarchs. Around the altar, he dug a deep trench, capable of holding a large amount of water, and prepared the sacrifice. The narrator, with his solemn voice, describes the ritual in a deliberately contrasting way with the previous frenzy. Elijah's preparation was methodical, reverent, imbued with purpose and meaning, devoid of any human spectacle, focused only on the glory of God. Then came the final test, the act that would make the miracle humanly impossible and the divine intervention undeniable. Elijah ordered that 4 pitchers of water be poured over the burnt offering and the wood, and the people who for years had seen water used only for survival watched in astonishment at the sacred waste. The prophet was not satisfied with that. He ordered them to do the same a second time, and then a third, until the water flowed abundantly over the wood, soaking the sacrifice and filling the trench around the altar. That excess of water, amidst the devastating drought, was the antithesis of disbelief, the guarantee that, if fire came, it would come from heaven and not from the hand of man. The tension reached its peak, and the hearts of the people beat in unison with expectation and terror. Elijah finally approached the altar, no longer as the man of discreet provision in the desert, but as the spokesman of the Most High, the voice of a transcendent power. His prayer was not long nor full of dramatic pleas. It was a direct invocation, an appeal for the faithfulness of the covenant and the honor of the name. O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. He prayed with powerful simplicity, asking that the answer come so that the people would know that he was the Lord and that he would turn their hearts back. The omniscient narrator, with the restrained emotion of one who witnesses the inevitable, prepares the reader for the climax of the story, the inevitable fulfillment of the divine promise that was about to manifest itself with overwhelming majesty. The words had barely left the prophet's lips when the sky, which had been silent for years, responded with indescribable force, the physical manifestation of an unbreakable covenant. It was not a small fire, nor a flickering flame, but an incandescent lightning bolt, a torrent of celestial fire that descended with terrifying speed and a power that defied nature. The narrator describes the scene with cinematic intensity. The fire of the Eternal burst upon the altar, consuming the soaked burnt offering in an instant, transforming the flesh and wood into volatile ashes. The heat was palpable, the smell of sacred incineration hung in the air, and the contrast with the previous silence was deafening, a roar of power that silenced all doubt. The fire was not confined to the sacrifice. Its divine fury extended, engulfing the stones of the altar, which disintegrated under the supernatural heat and licking the dust and soil around it, instantly drying up the water that filled the trench with the violence of a cosmic furnace. It was a total and irrefutable demonstration of the sovereignty of the God of Israel. The visual and emotional impact on the people was gigantic. They saw the impossible materialize, the promise fulfilled with a majesty that transcended human comprehension. The shock paralyzed the prophets of Baal, who watched in mute terror the annihilation of their stage and the total exposure of their farce. Their skepticism transformed into icy dread. Faced with that overwhelming display of power, the collective transformation was instantaneous and dramatic. The people, who moments before had wavered between two opinions, fell face down on the ground in an act of submission and reverence that sprang from the depths of their souls. The unanimous cry of confession tore through the air of Carmel. The Lord is God. The Lord is God. That moment was not merely a spiritual victory, but a rebirth of faith for an entire generation, a watershed moment that erased the years of apostasy and brought to the surface the memory of the covenant. Indignation at the injustice suffered during the drought gave way to satisfaction at the victory of faith and to the reverent fear of the God who answers with fire. The triumph of the Eternal demanded the fulfillment of justice. Elijah, driven by divine zeal and the law of Moses, commanded the people not to let a single one of the 450 prophets of Baal escape, those truly responsible for leading Israel astray and perpetuating spiritual and physical misery. This was not an act of personal vengeance, but the execution of sovereign justice against those who had incited the worship of idols and shed the blood of the Lord's prophets. The narrator, with the voice of the chronicler of a sacred epic, emphasizes that the nation's destiny depended on this purification. The false prophets, once arrogant in their rituals, were led to the Kishon River, where they met the end of their malice, and the land of Israel began to be cleansed of the abomination that had parched it. The purification of the land and the restoration of the altar were the prelude to the end of the drought, the sign that the covenant was being renewed and the punishment suspended. Elijah, with the authority of one who had witnessed the glory of God, ascended to the top of Carmel, while Ahab withdrew to eat. The scene contrasted the man of God, focused on intercession, with the king, still bound to earthly appetites, even after the supernatural manifestation. The prophet bowed down to the ground, placing his face between his knees, in a position of profound humility and supplication, crying out for the rain that would seal the triumph and bring complete redemption to the exhausted land. The narrator emphasizes that prayer was the key to turning destiny around, the link between divine will and human need. The prophet sent his servant to observe the sea, an act of persistent faith that taught the lesson of perseverance in prayer. 6 times the servant returned with the same answer: there is nothing. The waiting after the spectacular fire was a subtle test of Elijah's faith and a reminder that God's power manifests itself in due time, not in human impatience. The prophet's determination did not waver. He knew that the promise had been sealed on the altar of fire and that rain was the inevitable complement to victory. On the 7th time, the servant returned, not with a vision of dark clouds, but with the description of a small cloud the size of a man's hand rising from the sea. That tiny wisp of vapor on the horizon was confirmation of the Eternal's word and a sign that complete transformation was on its way. Elijah, with prophetic urgency, ordered his servant to warn Ahab to quickly descend from the mountain before the rain stopped him. The cloud, once insignificant, began to grow with astonishing speed, engulfing the sky in a darkness that was, paradoxically, the promise of life. The wind rose, howling across Carmel, and the dry air that had reigned for years was replaced by the damp scent of approaching rain, an aroma of hope and forgiveness. The climax of redemption manifested itself in a storm of epic proportions. The sky opened in torrents, and the water, which had been denied for years of apostasy, now fell with a purifying fury, washing away the dust and blood from the earth. The sound of the rain beating on the cracked ground was the symphony of Israel's return to its God. The contrast was vivid. The before was the dry, barren, and cursed land. The after was the flooded land, promising life and abundant harvests, a tangible symbol of restored favor. Ahab, caught off guard by the flood, fled in his chariot, but Elijah, driven by the hand of the Eternal, ran ahead of him to the entrance of Jezreel, showing that spiritual power surpassed real strength, and that faith had triumphed over human weakness. The arrival of the rain, the cleansing of Mount Carmel, and the manifestation of the fire were not merely climatic or religious events. They were the inevitable fulfillment of the promise that the Eternal One would never abandon his people, even in the midst of their deepest betrayal. That day became a living legend, a memory to be recounted from generation to generation, the chronicle of the day when divine justice descended from heaven to wash away the shame of Israel. Elijah, the man of the desert, had become the instrument of redemption, the channel through which the covenant was reaffirmed with power and glory. His legacy was not that of a mere prophet, but that of a restorer. If you're enjoying this story, take a second. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's continue with this exciting whose zeal rekindled the flame of dying faith in thousands of hearts. However, the triumph on Mount Carmel did not mean the immediate end of the prophet's ordeal. Human malice, personified in Queen Jezebel, was a more persistent enemy than the drought. When Ahab recounted to her all of Elijah's deeds and the execution of the prophets of Baal, her fury was relentless. She swore by her idol that the next day Elijah's life would be taken, a direct challenge to the power that had manifested itself on the mountain. The narrator reveals the prophet's profound suffering at this moment. The exaltation of victory was followed by a death threat that made him flee to save his life, a dramatic contrast that underscores human frailty even in the most anointed. Elijah, despite having witnessed fire from heaven, felt the weight of abandonment and loneliness, fleeing to the Judean desert, where he sat under a juniper tree and asked for death. "Enough! Take my life now, O Lord, for I am no better than my ancestors," he cried in his despair. That moment of profound humiliation was the human side of the epic, showing that even the greatest heroes of faith can be crushed by the pressure of persecution and the feeling that their work was in vain. The contrast between the prophet who defied hundreds of false priests and the exhausted man who asked for death was palpable, revealing the depths of his pain and the incomprehension that God's purpose was not yet complete. But the Eternal, who had answered with fire, would not abandon him in weakness, while Elijah slept under the meager shade of the juniper tree. An angel touched him and commanded him to eat bread baked over hot coals and a jar of fresh water, a miraculous provision for the journey that was beginning. The prophet ate and drank, but fell asleep again, exhausted in spirit. The angel returned a second time, reinforcing the order: "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." The subtle and compassionate divine intervention was the guarantee that the covenant of protection was active. Strengthened by that heavenly provision, Elijah walked 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, the place where the law had been given, to find the renewal of his mission and the reaffirmation of his purpose. On Mount Horeb, the prophet, exhausted and embittered, sought refuge in the sacred cave, feeling himself the last bastion of a faith that seemed doomed to extinction. The Eternal, with a patience that transcends anger, asked him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet's response was a bitter lament. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty, because the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The narrator exposes Elijah's pain and loneliness, the conviction that he was the only faithful remnant, a belief that needed to be corrected by the divine perspective. The Eternal One's answer: did not come amidst a display of power similar to that on Mount Carmel, but in a manifestation that would teach Elijah the subtle and profound nature of the continuity of his work. The Lord commanded him to stand on the mountain. First, a strong and impetuous wind came, splitting the mountains and breaking the rocks, but the Eternal One was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake. The earth trembled at its base, but the Eternal One was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, perhaps a doom reminder of the power seen on Mount Carmel, but the Eternal One was not in the fire. That vivid contrast taught that the divine presence was not limited to grandiose acts of judgment, but also manifested itself in silent persistence. After the fire came a soft, gentle sound, the murmur of an almost inaudible voice, the whisper of a breeze that nevertheless carried the fullness of divine majesty. The narrator describes Elijah's reverence. Upon hearing the sound, he covered his face with his cloak and went out to the entrance of the cave, recognizing that God's true power lay not only in public display, but in the intimacy of his communication. That moment was the prophet's most profound spiritual transformation, the understanding that God's work would continue through silent faithfulness and prophetic succession, and not merely through the drama of direct intervention. The Eternal One then revealed his plan, dispelling Elijah's illusion of loneliness. He instructed him to anoint Hazael as king of Syria, Jehu as king of Israel, and most importantly Elisha, son of Shaphat, as prophet in his place. That act of succession was the guarantee that the flame of truth would not be extinguished. Furthermore, the Lord comforted Elijah with a surprising revelation. Yet I have left in Israel 7,000, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. That silent remnant, which had remained faithful amidst the apostasy, was proof that faith had not died and that the prophet's work had been successful, even if he had not realized it. The journey of trial was, finally, transforming into a legacy of multiplication. Strengthened by the presence and the new commission at Horeb, Elijah returned to his mission with renewed conviction, the certainty that he was not alone and that his work would continue. The contrast between the desolate man under the juniper tree and the resolute prophet who descended from the mountain was evidence of spiritual transformation. The first act of his return was to find Elisha, who was plowing the land with 12 yoke of oxen, a man of means, but with a heart ready for the calling. Elijah simply threw his mantle over him, a symbolic gesture that transferred prophetic authority and sealed their fate. Elisha immediately understood the meaning of that mantle. He ran after Elijah, asking permission to say goodbye to his parents, but the prophet's response was a challenge, a test of the cost of discipleship. The young man, however, demonstrated his total commitment. He took the yoke of oxen and sacrificed them, cooking the meat on the wood of the farming implements, and gave it to the people to eat. That was a public and irrevocable act of burning bridges, a demonstration that he would no longer look back. The narrator emphasizes that Elijah's legacy was now secure in the hands of a successor, guaranteeing the continuity of truth in Israel. Years of joint ministry passed, during which Elijah and Elisha worked to restore faith, facing the continued resistance of the house of Ahab and the remnants of idolatry. Divine justice, which had manifested itself on Mount Carmel, continued to unfold in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah through acts of judgment and mercy. The prophet, who had once felt loneliness, now led a school of prophets, witnessing the multiplication of his ministry and the growth of the 7,000 faithful who had not bowed their knees to Baal. The malice of Jezebel and the weakness of Ahab, though persistent, were increasingly confronted by the unwavering authority of the word. The story of Elijah was heading towards a conclusion as spectacular as the fire of Carmel, a final triumph that would seal his faithfulness and elevate him to the status of a living legend. The moment of his departure was approaching, and the Eternal One planned an end worthy of the prophet who had fought against false kings and gods. Elijah, knowing what was to come, tried to distance himself from Elisha, testing the loyalty of his successor. The narrator, his voice choked with the solemnity of the moment, recounts Elisha's unwavering insistence. "As surely as the Lord lives, and as surely as you live, I will not leave you." This disciple's faithfulness was the final proof that the legacy would be honored and the mission continued with redoubled zeal. The final journey of Elijah and Elisha was marked by a series of encounters with the sons of the prophets in Bethel and Jericho, who, aware of Elijah's imminent ascension, approached him with questions filled with reverent awe. The prophet, however, did not give them details, maintaining the mystery of his departure. Sadness hung in the air as the generation of prophets understood that they were about to lose their mentor and spiritual leader, the one who had dared to challenge royal power. and restore the altar of the Eternal. The narrator emphasizes that Elijah was not merely leaving a successor, he was leaving a vacuum of authority and a legacy of courage that would require twice the power to fill, according to Elisha's secret desire. Reaching the banks of the Jordan River, the last frontier before the final triumph, Elijah performed a miracle that served as a final demonstration of his bestowed power. He took his cloak, folded it, and struck the waters of the river. Immediately the waters parted, opening a dry path in the middle, and the two prophets crossed the riverbed, observed from a distance by 50 of the sons of the prophets. That act was the antithesis of what had happened on Carmel. There fire had consumed the water. Here the cloak of authority parted it. It was proof that God's power manifested itself not only in judgment, but also in provision and control over nature. A final lesson for Elisha. Elijah, knowing his time was numbered, asked Elisha what he would like done for him before he was taken. Elisha's request was bold and revealing of his zeal. I ask that a double portion of your spirit be upon me. The narrator exposes the successor's holy ambition, the desire not only to continue the ministry, but to do so with even greater authority and power. Elijah, with the wisdom that precedes glory, replied that the request was difficult, but it would be granted if Elisha saw him taken. That moment was the final test of vigilance and the promise that the covenant of power would be fully transferred. As they walked and talked, the scene of the ascension unfolded with a majesty that surpassed the drama of Carmel. Suddenly, a chariot of fire and horses of fire burst onto the scene, separating the two prophets. Fire, which had been the element of divine justice on earth, now became the vehicle of celestial glory. Elijah was caught up in a whirlwind to heaven, in a triumph that sealed his faithfulness and spared him from death, an inevitable fulfillment of his life, dedicated to obedience and zeal. The narrator, his voice choked with reverence, describes the scene as the crowning achievement of a life of trial, the total victory over the malice of kings and the power of false gods. Elisha's cry echoed through the valley, a lament of profound sorrow and recognition. My father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. He tore his clothes in mourning and reverence, but his eyes were fixed on the sky, where Elijah's trail of fire disappeared. The prophet who had witnessed the fire from heaven and the drought now witnessed the most glorious of ascensions, the unquestionable proof that Elijah was no ordinary man, but an ambassador of the Most High. That rapture was not merely the end of a life, but the consecration of a legacy, evidence that faithfulness, even amidst solitude and persecution, is rewarded with glory. On the ground remained only Elijah's mantle, the cloak that had struck the Jordan and symbolized prophetic authority and power. Elisha picked up the mantle, an object now sacred and laden with meaning, and returned to the riverbank. His heart was torn between the pain of loss and the certainty of the promise. The moment was a test. The double portion of the Spirit had been promised, but he needed to manifest faith to claim it. He took Elijah's mantle and struck the waters of the Jordan, repeating the gesture of his master, and cried out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" Immediately, the waters of the Jordan parted for the second time, opening a dry path for Elisha. This act was the public and undeniable confirmation of the transfer of power, the sign that the double portion had been granted. The 50 sons of the prophets, who had been watching from a distance, upon seeing the miracle, prostrated themselves before Elisha, recognizing that the spirit of Elijah rested upon him. The narrator describes the satisfaction and reverence. Lament turned into recognition, and doubt into certainty. Elijah's triumph was now Elisha's triumph, guaranteeing the continuation of the fight against idolatry and spiritual weakness. The malice and skepticism of the antagonists, who had been temporarily silenced on Mount Carmel, met their final judgment in the continuation of the story. The legacy of Elijah, manifested in the ministry of Elisha, continued to press upon the kingdom of Israel, culminating in the fulfillment of the prophecies of judgment. The prophet had anointed Jehu as king, the instrument chosen by the Eternal to eradicate the house of Ahab and the influence of Jezebel. The shock and repentance of the enemies of the covenant materialized in the terror of the execution of divine justice, which would not spare those who had incited apostasy and shed the blood of the righteous. The final transformation of Israel, though gradual, was guaranteed by the fire of Mount Carmel and the whirlpool of the Jordan. The triumph of the Eternal over Baal, begun on Mount Carmel, met its bitter conclusion in the city of Jezreel, the place where Queen Jezebel, in her unwavering arrogance, continued to conspire against divine justice. The prophet Elisha, acting under the authority of Elijah and the design of God, sent one of the sons of the prophets to anoint Jehu the commander of the army, as king of Israel, with the explicit mission of destroying the house of Ahab and avenging the blood of the Lord's servants. The narrator, with the voice of destiny, recounts that Elijah's prophecy that dogs would devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel was about to be fulfilled. Proof that the word of the Eternal does not return empty. Jehu, driven by divine zeal and the promise of power, acted with relentless fury, executing King Joram, son of Ahab, and King Ahaziah of Judah. The coup was swift and decisive, demonstrating that the spiritual fragility of Ahab's dynasty could not withstand the force of justice. Shock and terror spread through the palace as the inevitability of judgment became palpable. This was the unfolding of the Eternal's contained wrath, vengeance for the innocent, blood of Naboth, and the annihilation of Baal's influence in Israel, a spectacle of redemption through the destruction of evil. The moment of the final confrontation with Jezebel was dramatic and full of horror. Upon learning of Jehu's arrival, the queen, with her characteristic insolence, painted her face and arranged her hair, standing at the palace window, defying the new king with scorn. "Was there peace, Zimri, you who killed your master?" Her malice and skepticism were evident until the very end, her refusal to acknowledge the sovereignty of a power greater than her idols. The narrator underlines the arrogance of evil that precedes the fall, the contrast between vain pomp and the approaching ruin. Jehu's response was short and definitive, a reflection of the judgment that had already been pronounced. He ordered the eunuchs to throw her out the window. The fall of Queen Jezebel symbolized the fall of idolatry and tyranny in Israel, an act that brought satisfaction and relief to the hearts of the oppressed people. The narrator describes the scene with the starkness of history. Her blood splattered on the wall and the horses, and her body was trampled. When they went to retrieve her body for burial, they found only her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. The rest had been devoured by dogs, fulfilling exactly the prophecy of Elijah at the wall of Jezreel. The triumph of faith was complete, divine justice consummated with implacable precision, undeniably elevating the moral of the story. The legacy of Elijah and the triumph of Carmel extended to the restoration of worship to the Eternal in Israel. The nation had witnessed the before and after of the trial. The before was drought, famine, division, and spiritual death. The after was rain, harvest, unity of faith, and the destruction of enemies. The story of Elijah became the cornerstone of hope, an epic tale of redemption that taught that faithfulness to God, even in the minority and under persecution, is the only path to victory. Satisfaction with justice and reverence for divine power permeated the atmosphere of a kingdom that had been rescued from the brink of the abyss. The transformation, however, was not limited to the public sphere. Elijah's journey, from the solitude of Cherith to the fire of Carmel and the whirlpool of the Jordan, represented the spiritual and physical transformation of the protagonist himself. He had evolved from the prophet who announced judgment to the intercessor, who cried out for mercy, from the man who asked for death under the juniper tree to the warrior of faith who was taken up in glory. His life was a vivid testimony to the truth that trials do not destroy faith, but refine it, and that obedience is the passport to final triumph and eternal glory. Elijah's epic was not just about a miracle, but about the manifestation of God's faithfulness in a man. The tale of Mount Carmel and the subsequent fall of the house of Ahab and Jezebel are etched in the memory of Israel as irrefutable proof that the God of the covenant is a God of justice and unparalleled power. Elijah's triumph was not an end, but a new beginning, the rebirth of faith that would continue to guide the people through dark times. The sense of redemption was profound. The land, once dry, now flourished, and the silence of doubt had been replaced by the clamor of true worship. The skeptics were silenced, the arrogant humbled, and the faithful exalted. Elijah's legacy was not that of a man who avoided adversity, but of one who faced it with the zeal of the Eternal, becoming the archetype of the prophet who would come before the great day. Thus, the saga of Elijah concludes with the echo of his cry on Mount Carmel and the whisper of his ascension in the Jordan. He who had known the deepest solitude and apparent abandonment ended his journey in unparalleled glory, leaving behind an anointed successor and a purified nation. The epic tale of trial, faith, and divine triumph served to elevate the moral of the story, showing that however dark the spiritual crisis or devastating the drought, the inevitable fulfillment of the promise lies in unwavering faithfulness to God. Elijah the Tishbite became the living chronicle of the majesty of divine intervention, a beacon of hope that continues to inspire reverence, indignation against injustice, and profound satisfaction in the victory of faith. Do you want more Bible stories filled with faith, teachings, and heartwarming moments? Subscribe and turn on notifications to follow us with each new story.